after the Francis Scott Key Bridge was taken down recently, struck by a container ship. We're trying to clear a pathway to the ports there in the Baltimore area. The latest on this, I want to bring in Sal Mercogliano now, an associate professor of history at Campbell University and an adjunct professor at the United States Merchant Marine Academy. Sir, great to have you with us on the program. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
This obviously, this is a tremendous effort. It involves a lot of different levels of government, a lot of expertise that the average person doesn't have. Give us your sense right now of how the cleanup is going.
Well, I think we've been getting updates from the Unified Command Authority. It's a huge undertaking. I think people are underestimating the amount that has to be done here. You've got three things going on concurrently. You've got to stabilize the vessel, the dolly. It's aground, hard up against the pylon. It's got about 4 tons of bridge on its forward bow. So that issue is a massive one just by itself. And then you throw in the collapse of the bridge across the main channel. That bridge has collapsed onto itself and buried itself in the mud 50 feet down. And then you have the ancillary sections of the bridge that also have to be cleared. So this is a massive undertaking.
I just can't imagine. I mean, what kind of work goes into cutting apart pieces of a bridge that's that far underwater? That must take immense talent, first and foremost, but the kind of tech that most of us don't usually ever see.
Well, I mean, you're talking about going underwater. You're talking about having to cut pieces that can be hoisted by the cranes you have on site, which aren't the biggest cranes in the world. So that means a lot of cutting has to be done. What you literally have right now is divers going underwater in almost zero visibility, being talked into position because they're being observed on sonar and side scan sonar and directed to where to go to feel the bridge and then to do cutting. It's really intricate, not for the claustrophobic. And as you start getting deeper and deeper, you got issues with decompression as you start going over 35 feet.
Just amazing. So I saw John Conrad over at G Captain, who we talked to last week on this very issue, was pointing out what you just pointed out, which is that we're not even using the biggest cranes available to us on the planet. Other countries do have bigger cranes than we have. Can we seek to get access to those cranes as a way to help this cleanup effort along?
Well, I mean, we have bigger cranes right here in the United States. We have the crane that helped build the Tappan Zee Bridge up in New York. We got the VB 10,000, which helped with the salvage of the Golden Ray down in Florida. So, I mean, we really need to be tapping into a lot of resources. But really, the big issue is cranes are great, but we have to have a good, solid plan first in how they're going to go about moving the bridge off the ship and then out of the channel. Because, again, is it going to be a cutting operation and we're going to cut it into pieces? Are we going to drag it out of the channel? Those are the type of things. And the problem is we're still doing that sonar and analysis so that we can really come up with a good plan. The ship has been heavily damaged up forward. And so it's not an easy prospect just to move it. Plus, the ship is pinned down on top of a gas pipeline, so the ship has to be raised before it can be pulled out.
Holy cow. So who's in charge here in the end? I know you talk about a unified command, but who's ultimately in charge of this whole operation?
So they're using a unified command approach, which means there's a series of organizations, and so they're working collectively. You've seen Governor Moore come out and be kind of the spokesman for this. There's a lot of debate about it. I really believe that if you look at a situation like we had with Deepwater Horizon, you want a kind of national incident commander, very much like what Admiral Thad Allen of the Coast Guard did.
Right.
There is no one person who's appointed that right now, but this is a very unique operation. This is unlike a hurricane or a tornado that's over a vast, long distance. This is very concentrated with state, local, national assets in place, along with international assets. The ship is registered in Singapore. You have 3 different salvage companies at work here. So there's a lot of issues going on here, and I really firmly believe they need to eventually appoint a national incident commander.
Sure. Among the people not really making themselves that public here has been Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, who you would think would be all over this, but hasn't been that present. But you point out something that we've been hearing, which is that Governor Wes Moore seems to be the most visible senior official being attentive to this.
He is, and he's leading the press conferences, and he's really trying to learn. But again, it's kind of outside his area of expertise. And what you really want is someone who is well versed in dealing with all these entities to be a kind of key decision maker. The problem you're going to have is you're going to cross paths here with the use of assets and a schedule that meets everyone's needs. And I think until that really gets resolved, right now we're seeing very positive out of those press conferences. Everybody's getting along great.
Right.
Everything seems to be working, but that's going to run thin soon.
I'm sure it is. So, in an ideal world, how quickly could we see this wreckage cleared and these lanes for ships reopened?
Well, I mean, we're talking months probably till you get any sort of major movement. At least a month. You've got to get the ship out, and again, this is not an easy salve. It took a month to clear Everforward out of the channel in Baltimore. They're just now starting the process of removing containers from the forward portion of Dolly. They got to lighten her up. They got to get in there so they can make cuts and start removing parts of the bridge off of her. And then, this bridge has not just collapsed, but it's sunk into the mud. And so you've got to remove the entire structure to get the full draft necessary, because you got to get down to 50 feet for the coal carriers and the large container ships that come into the port.
It's wild. So obviously we're in the very early stages. We just have to remove the wreckage. The act of actually rebuilding the bridge, though, based on what you're describing, we're easily looking at years before that bridge is reopened.
Oh, I believe that entirely. I think you're looking at a long-term prospect of that, and what's really surprising me right now is that we don't see a lot of cargo moving in and out of the port of Baltimore. They announced these opening of these channels, but they're very shallow draft channels. One of the things I would think the government would want to do is start setting up some sort of shuttle service to be moving cargo by tugs and barges or by military craft into the port of Baltimore from maybe Norfolk or Philadelphia, so that they can ease the congestion off the roads and highways and at least get some work going into the docks of Baltimore and get some cargo out.
Do you have a sense of how much this the shuttering of these ports here in Baltimore has affected the other ports on the east coast of the United States? Are we seeing that already?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing congestion in the ports. It's going to start manifesting itself. The vehicles are going to be one of the biggest. I mean, you have a port here that deals with 60, 70,000 vehicles monthly, and those have got to go somewhere else. And that's going to be a big problem, because there's just not the facilities to take that. Same thing with the coal. There's nowhere to really export that coal that can come out. So coal is going to start backing up. Sugar and salt imports can't go anywhere else. They have to go to the facilities that are there. So it's going to have impact. And, we can also expect to see insurance companies for shipping start relooking at ships coming into U.S. ports, and raising the concern if you're sailing into a port with an infrastructure that may not be up to par, I may have to start charging you some extra money.
And on the actual protection of our bridges, I know that there's been some discussion in the wake of this bridge collapse for those of us who were unaware of how easily something like this could happen, that there be barriers blocking ships from getting so close to the main support structure for a bridge like this. Do you think that this will spur along that kind of conversation, certainly, and an effort to protect bridges across the country now?
Well, those conversations were happening. I mean, when the Port of Baltimore looked to expand, they were dredging the harbor. I mean, they had a deep draft harbor pretty much to begin with.
Right.
But they brought in the bigger cranes in. But the problem you have is our ports and our waterways are very bifurcated. The terminals, the port is a local entity. It's a state entity, whereas the waters are federal, and then the bridges are controlled by the state of Maryland Department of Transportation. So that, who's there watching the big picture that, okay, you're expanding the port, you're bringing these bigger ships in. We really need to make these bridges more robust. And entities like the U.S. Maritime Administration under Secretary Buttigieg in the Department of Transportation should have been looking at this, but unfortunately they don't have the resources, the people, the money to do these type of studies. And unfortunately there is no one really there to catch it.
In terms of the other aspects of a federal government role, there's going to be, I imagine, a decent amount of red tape in the way throughout this process, especially when it comes to rebuilding that bridge. My guess is you'd be for trying to get through a lot of that as quickly as possible.
Well, I think you need to do what you can to expedite and accelerate it as much as you can. But again, there was no plan to replace that bridge, so
Yeah.
there's no design at all that's in the works right now. So plus you're going to have to redesign that bridge to a new design so that it can be reinforced. You probably want to build it higher so to allow bigger ships to come into the harbor. So we're talking about some major changes. You probably want to move the pedestals further away from the shipping channel.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is a huge, massive endeavor that is going to take time for the Port of Baltimore.
And Sal Mercogliano, do we have the brain power here in the United States to handle all of this? It sounds like there's a lot of complex issues here. Do we have the people who can handle it? Are we well equipped as a country at this moment?
Well, I think we have the people to handle it. The problem is, can you get the right people into the room? And that's always been a big issue. We tend to be very much, focused on one thing at a time. So we're looking at the salvage right now, but like the issue I said with moving cargo, I'd like to think there's somebody, in a room right now looking about how can we get some cargo flowing past the bridge into the Port of Baltimore right now. And so you just need to bring the right people. The problem is you need good leadership for that. You need someone who can sit there and look past the disaster and also be looking forward. And unfortunately, I think what we're doing right now is we're just so fixated on the bridge and the disaster that we're kind of missing what we can do in the short term to start alleviating some of the pressure in and around the Port of Baltimore.
Amen. All right. Well, Sal Mercogliano, thank you very much for your expertise and your time today. Really appreciate you, and I hope you can come back soon so we can talk about this as it progresses.